let's talk about how to write for natural brands. As a writer, you may find yourself gravitating towards very purpose-driven brands like Patagonia, or outdoorsy brands like REI, or lifestyle brands like natural skincare or CBD. All of these brands actually share some very common traits when it comes to their voice and tone. And so I want to explain to you what those are. I find that helping writers understand some of the archetypes of common brand voices and tones really helps you get to the finish line faster. It helps you create kind of a lexicon of vocabulary and tone dynamics and phrasing choices that you can plug and play and input into a variety of different contexts. So whether you're writing an email sequence, or you're writing Facebook posts, or you're writing blogs, you can know that a lot of the tone choices you make are pretty predictable, which makes your choices and process of writing for brands like this a lot easier. I'm Joy Yule from Hire a Writer. In my company, we've created 6 archetypes that we think represent pretty much any kind of brand in the world. Obviously, there's a lot of adaptation, and you customize those brand voices into your specific context, but having the framework for it, we find, helps writers a lot. So I'm going to dive into how to write for natural brands, an archetype that we call Anne. All right, so we'll pull it up on the computer, if I can figure it out. All right, so let's talk about Anne. Anne is an archetype that many people enjoy writing for. And when it comes to a freelancer or even a staff writer for a company like this, it's very important that you avoid some of the pitfalls and some of the tropes that you could really be at risk of using when you're writing for a brand like this. Like I said at the very beginning, this is very kind of purpose-driven, right? So when we think of who Anne is, if we were to kind of to my earlier, explanation, we use the word archetypes. Think of them like characters, right? If you were to put Tom's as a brand, as a character, Anne would be able to speak in that voice pretty well. It helps you humanize your writing when you think of it this way. And I get that we're kind of anthropomorphizing and anthropopathizing brands, but I feel there's a legitimacy to it as a creative exercise, again, that helps you write for brands like this more effectively. Some of the ones that are probably most familiar to you, things like Schmidt's, 7th Generation, Whole Foods, and then you get into some of the lifestyle brands. So we think like Free People, which is a clothing brand, Lush, which is a cosmetics brand. A lot of freelancers are very drawn towards brands like this, but it's absolutely a misconception that just because you have an interest in these kind of fields, like personally, like, hey, I'm personally only want to buy from purpose-driven brands, that doesn't actually make it easier to write for brands like this. I actually find this extremely challenging to write in the voice of Anne, although I have some writers who are just very good at it. So how do you be good at it? You be good at it by being like this: descriptive, dreamy, warm, invitational. It's very easy to write a bank of CTAs for Anne, right? Because by nature, we're talking about an archetype or a character that is warm and fuzzy, that is deep, that is a little bit emotional, that feels things deeply. They're convicted, but they're also very relational. So there's a huge element of kind of that tribal marketing or community that you want to think through as you're crafting marketing copy for a brand like this. They want to build a tribe. They want to build a community. And a lot of times you won't call it that. You'll call it a place of belonging, right? People want to belong. So there's a real hand over heart. A misnomer, I would say, that maybe misconception is a better way to put it. A misconception that a lot of people have when writing for brands like this is that it is trite or maybe that you're appealing to emotion primarily. I don't actually think that's the case. I think it's more often like spiritual. Think like Joanna Gaines from whatever that like home show is, right? How you walk in Magnolia, right? She's got like some kind of home brand. If you walk into a Target and you walk into like that section of the Target where it's been like pimped out with whatever that home product is, walking through there, that's Anne. That feeling of like a very curated environment. Everything's there very much on purpose. There is often a minimalism to it, right? So you think of like a skincare brand, the ones that are like just completely white with one word, right? So from a design perspective, there's a lot of kind of application here. So Anne is definitely not a maximalist either in look or language, which is important for you as a copywriter to understand. So the language element of it, you need to say more with less. which gives you a lot of freedom with adjectives and storytelling and some of that kind of descriptive language, which I guess is just another way of saying adjectives. So the literature reference, and we like to always have literary references and pop culture references for all of these archetypes, because I think it helps you connect some dots, right? What's familiar? Anne of Green Gables, and not just because that's her name. So think of Anne of Green Gables, right? A will-o-wisp, right? She's dreamy, she's romantic, she's aspirational, she's optimistic. And the quote is that kindred spirits are not so scarce as I used to think. It's splendid to find out there are so many of them in the world. So it's not naive, it's convinced, right? It's a principled stance, but there's also just this incredible warmth that permeates how this character comes across in the world, and that would be very similar to how Anne comes across. One thing I want to point out in this is the tactile nature of this brand type. Often you are selling things that are creamy or warm or soft or snuggly. And it's not even just the products themselves that you're describing, but you're describing the experience of a lifestyle. So thinking through what you put in your body, what you put on your body, how you walk through the world with intention, okay? So back to the kind of the point about adjectives, you can use a lot of tactile sensory language when you're writing for a brand like this, and it won't come across as glib or silly. It'll come across as kind of meaningful and purposeful. And then in culture, so let's think about kind of, if you were to think about the personality types that could be represented in Anne, we've got like Anne Hathaway, right? She's beautiful, she's sophisticated, but she also is very honest. Maya Angelou, obviously a master user of language and lyric. Wes Anderson, so think about the quirky curation of a Wes Anderson film, if you're familiar with that reference. It could be a really important one as you think this through, because there's a risk of over-feminizing when you write in this voice, so tying it back to any kind of male reference is probably helpful. And then like Elizabeth Olsen, right? Somebody who's exceptionally successful, but also very prolific and articulate, right? So there's a great intelligence to these kind of characters. I think I used that picture twice, sorry. So think about the sights, the smells, the feelings, right? The look, a redhead. There's a uniqueness to this. And the kind of tribe that's attracted to a brand when you write like this is strong. They're attracted to brands like these because the products they use and the things they surround themselves and the environment in which they live actually become like part and parcel of their identity. So think about somebody who's very passionate about music, or very passionate about a certain author in literature, or very passionate about a cause. That feeling, that conviction, and then the actions on that conviction is what you want to tap into with a brand like this. So yes, you're thinking about kind of how the brand comes across, and that's what I'm trying to kind of describe to you as you build a body of work in a brand, for a brand like this. But there's also a great and very, very close connection to who you're speaking to and what you're tapping into when you use words like this, when you describe a lifestyle, when you paint a picture, when you cast a vision for what it's like to live in this world with these kind of sensibilities. So when you're writing for a brand like Anne, here's what it feels like. We like to use this kind of language when we're describing these archetypes. It's a walk by the ocean with a friend. So think about the sensory. Think about your feet on the wet sand, the slight ocean spray, the birds, the wind. Think about all the experience of that. And then not just being out in nature with this beautiful multi-sensory experience, but doing so in community, doing so with somebody you love or you care for and you can communicate with and connect with on a human level. That's the power. If you can encapsulate this feeling in language, you'll be successful writing for brands like this, because that's absolutely what they want, right? So it's life's tenderest moments, the meaningful, the generous, the above and beyond, the kind, the slow down and pay attention, all of that, the sacred space. So think through all those kind of language and ideas when you're looking at writing for a brand like this. I often find, and this is something that we have done on purpose, that analyzing the taglines of brands that you would say probably reflect or do this voice well is important. And yes, I realize Schmitz is lacking periods. Oh, it's because they're not complete sentences. Okay, that stressed me out as an editor for a second. Okay, Tom's. stylish shoes for everyone. It's inclusive, it's meaningful. We know what Tom's is, we know what Tom stands for, the philanthropic angle, all of that. Lush, fresh handmade cosmetics, just fresh handmade cosmetics. Simple. But what does that tell you? It tells you it's something valuable, but that it's also something meaningful, handmade. A human touched this with their warm hands. Free People, women's boho clothing and bohemian fashion. Terrible. Okay. I don't know why we use that example. Seventh generation. We believe in a seventh generation. Doesn't that make you want to know more? Well, what do we believe? Who's we? Am I part of that we? Maybe that's what I believe too, right? That mini, to the first slide, that invitation to think more, to pique curiosity, to encourage, right? To encourage exploration of what this brand is and what it represents in the world, and maybe I need to be a part of that. Schmidt's, natural deodorant, supernatural protection. So this is an important point, and I think we included this on purpose to kind of remind ourselves, just because Anne is so serious-minded in a lot of ways, right? She's convicted. She's and I realize I'm feminizing it, but this character is, very passionate and a part of the world, and maybe a little spiritual and all that. But there's also a sense of humor, right? So there's also a humanity to it, a levity to it, because any brand that takes itself too seriously is probably going to turn off Gen Z, because they're authenticity police. And then Whole Foods, whatever makes you whole. Whole is an exceptional word, and one that you will probably find good use for as you write for brands like this. So that's Anne. I understand that was a light treatment of it, but I would suggest to you there are a lot of literary references. You can read poetry. You can read a lot of fiction. You can read a lot of, fiction that was written in Victorian times. If you haven't read Jane Austen, if you haven't read Charlotte Bronte, so think through kind of giving yourself a really good repertoire of literary input. And then there's also a lot of music that will help you, that has kinds of lyrics that will help you create this narrative and be able to write this way. So listening to really lyrically heavy, like Joshua Radin or Rachel Yamagata, or even like Fiona Apple and Regina Spektor, Amos Lee. So think about the more poetic, like maybe folk artists probably have a lot of the kind of language that you could start to expose yourself to build some references as you start to write for brands like this. I'm interested to know if you've had experience writing for brands like this, how it went. I've often found that the editorial process in any kind of company that wants to come across this way is actually really, really rigorous and borderline extensive because they're very passionate about the preciousness of every single word and phrase. But if you're building a tribe and every person who's a part of it is going to associate their personal identity with kind of the professional corporate messaging, then it is exceptionally important to be very, very conscientious about how you're coming across. So I look forward to kind of hearing your experiences. Feel free to drop it in the comments if you feel like you've, been exposed to a brand like this or struggled to write for a brand like this, or it's your aspiration to be this kind of writer. I would be interested to hear about your experiences and hopes and how it comes across and how you're able to pull it off. Subscribe to my channel, absolutely. Go to our blog at hireawriter.us/blog, // I don't know. And subscribe there. You can get like a weekly update. We write tons of blogs that help writers like you succeed, and we hope you do.